We are glad you're here. I'm very thankful again for this opportunity to pray as we have. I appreciate so much the prayer tonight and the reminders from this great book of Hebrews, and certainly the songs that have been selected so thoughtfully. I appreciate that. It's been good for us to be together, and I hope and pray that our efforts tonight in the lesson will be useful to you. We have suggested that it's our goal this year, my goal certainly, and I trust I'm not alone in it, to increase wisdom and to let God teach us how to be wise and to define what wisdom is. And so it's with that in mind that we have begun just a brief study, a few lessons. We hope, Lord willing, this summer, if the Lord wills and we're still living, to have a study of the wisdom literature in our survey of the Bible story. And so we'll be looking at Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon in a quarter. And so we look forward to that. But I want to draw my attention back to this great book, because I do think it has a blessing for us. One of the things that in you reading the book of Proverbs we are reminded of is that wisdom certainly is profitable, that wisdom will help us to gain foresight and insight. Wisdom will help us to humble our minds and to take direction, because we need direction. All of those things are a part of wisdom and what wisdom does for us. One of the things that we want to emphasize, however, too, is that wisdom has a reachable quality. That if somebody asked me to see if you can get your IQ up to 100 maybe just 100, I'd say, well, I don't know what I can do about that. But if the Lord challenges me to be wise, I can do that. That's not something innate. That's not something natural, something we're born with. Everybody's got to learn how to be wise. Even smart people have to learn how to be wise. So it's within reach, and it's so worth it. And it deals with everyday life. That's one point that I hope in this lesson and the next will come through, is that it deals with the everyday aspects of life. And we'll look at just a couple of examples of that. When you look in Proverbs, and we look at the structure of the book, we're not going to spend a lot of time with that, but the first 9 chapters sort of make a section, don't they? And in those first 9 chapters, we find over and over again, I don't remember exactly how many times it is, but it's a number of times in Proverbs that we find this expression, my son, or some expression like that. Over and again, we find this repeated. My son, for example, my son, 1 in verse 8, hear the instruction of thy father and forsake not the law of thy mother. And so as a godly parent, the wisdom personified speaks to us and calls us to their side. Come and learn from me so that you won't have to learn the hard way. I want to begin tonight in chapter 2 and in verse 1. As we divide the book, chapter 2 begins, my son, if you take my words to heart and treasure my commandments within you, if you pay close attention to wisdom and let your mind reach for understanding, if indeed you call out for insight, and if you ask aloud for understanding, if you search for wisdom as if it were money, and hunt for it as if it were hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord, and you will find the knowledge of God. What a great thought. You know, when you read that, this is a modern speech translation. The old translation is not far from this. But it talks about, pictures for us the idea of somebody hunting money or even hidden treasure. You know, there are still people, I think, who their living is their professional treasure hunters. I can't imagine doing that for a job, but there are people who do that. I've seen some videos of them anyway, and they look around, they have research, and they'll think, well, maybe there was an old ship that went down around here, we're going to try to find the treasure. You know, back as a kid, you know, X always marked the spot. But there are really people who do that. I don't know how many. I don't know that I've ever known anybody personally who made a living that way. But having watched them again and watched their stories, I'll tell you, these people are dedicated, sometimes obsessed. Sometimes a man will spend a lifetime searching for some sunken ship or some hidden buried treasure somewhere. And in some cases, they'll wind up spending more to try to find and dig up this treasure than it probably was worth to start with. It just becomes a matter of pride at some point. It seems rather pointless, and they likely never will find it. But you know, something more common and just as futile is this search for riches. Maybe it's not trying to find an old sunken ship or a buried treasure. But if you print a book, and this is a real book written by a fellow, Get Rich Quick, How to Make Money Online from Anywhere in the World. Get Rich Quick. I'll tell you, now that'll sell. And by the way, you know, nobody seems to ask the question, then what? Is my life going to be better? I think about that rather personally. If somebody dropped a bunch of money on me tomorrow, would that make my life better? Would it make it hard for me to go to heaven? Would it ruin my life? Would it ruin my relationships? Those are not questions. We just assume that more is better, and here's an easy way to get it. And because people think that's the key to success, then they chase it. The little cartoon here I thought was funny. You've probably seen things like this. This is a little bit dated, but it still makes the point. Behind this fellow standing at a podium is a banner, and the banner says, How to Get Rich Quick Seminar. And the little caption reads, quote, rent an auditorium, charge people $39.95 a seat. Thank you for coming. That's the way. Maybe it'd be $235, 39 instead of 39. But, you know, that's the idea. Get rich quick. Chase your tail around the room like a dog, you know. People chase after things. We know that so. Folks that ought to know better chase after things. One of the points that the Proverbs make, and it's something that cuts through so many decisions that people make today, is how foolish that is. And how instead take that effort and that obsession and put it in a direction that will last, that will matter. Let me go back to our text there in Proverbs 2 and verse 1. My son, if, there's the qualifier, if you take my words to heart and treasure my commandments within you, let my words be a treasure that you store up. Verse 2, if you pay close attention to wisdom and let your mind reach for understanding. Verse 3, if indeed you call out for insight, if you ask aloud for understanding. You get the idea that this is intentional, right? It's not just that I'm going to go through my life and maybe I'll bump into wisdom one day. It's the idea of someone who is after a treasure, and that treasure is wisdom. It's someone who is dedicated to finding an answer, and thus they find an answer. That's really where this, I guess, whole thing starts. How serious am I about being wise? How committed am I to that goal, to that aim? People are after so many things in life. How many people do you know right now, the Lord be the ultimate judge, who you think really are after wisdom? That's their number one goal. I want to be more wise. He goes on to say, verse 4, if you search for wisdom as if it were money and hunt for it as if it were hidden treasure, then, here's the then, if then you will understand the fear of the Lord and you will find the knowledge of God. It's reachable, it's attainable, it's lasting. It's what brings real success and happiness, not just in this world, but in the world to come. What do you want to be? I want to be doctor, lawyer, engine chief. I want to have a big house. I want to have a big car. I want to be wise, as God defines wise. Whatever may happen with the rest of those goals, that is attainable And that will bring a peace that nothing else will bring. That's the message of Proverbs. Let me keep reading here in chapter 2 and look in verse 6. For the Lord gives wisdom, and from His mouth comes knowledge and understanding. He stores up sound wisdom for the upright, and is a shield to those who walk in integrity, guarding, he says, the paths of the just and protecting the way of the faithful one. Here's a promise that's made, and that is that if you lean on God, God wants to protect you. That's why He offers the direction that He does, because He knows this is not just right, it's best. I remember another passage, a couple of them in fact. We've been looking at Deuteronomy fairly recently. And in Deuteronomy chapter 6 and in verse 24, an unforgettable part of that great book full of quotes, Moses' last sermons, includes this one. Deuteronomy 6 in verse 24 in the old translation. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our good always, that He might preserve us alive as it is this day. You know, sometimes when people ask the question, well, why did God say this? Why can't we do that? I know Moses was talking about the first covenant. I get that. But I think this principle is the answer to all those kind of questions. Well, why did God let us do this? Because it's not good for us. Why does He command this? Because it's for our good always. Wisdom is for our good always, even if it hurts in the short term. Even if it costs me, it's for our good always. The God who knows, who made man, knows what's best for man. And that's a great lesson. You know, that lesson is taught over and again in Deuteronomy. If you look back in that same chapter, in the first verse as we divide the book up, Deuteronomy 6 and verse 1, now these are the commandments, the statutes, the judgments, which the Lord your God commanded to teach you, that ye might do them in the land whither you go to possess it. You're starting anew here. I want you to take the wisdom of God with you. And the reason for that in part is because it's best for you. Verse 2, that thou mightest fear the Lord thy God, to keep all His statutes and His commandments, which I command thee, thou and thy son and thy son's sons, all the days of thy life, and that thy days may be prolonged. We find that in the Old Testament, don't we? More than one time. In the Ten Commandments, honor your father and mother, which is the first command with promise that it might be well with thee, that thou mayest live long on the earth. That's Paul's reference back to Moses' statement. Honor father and mother that it might be well with you in the land. God's way has a way of preserving life, and not just in terms of length, but in terms of quality. Keep us out of a lot of trouble. Keep us out of a lot of heartaches and sorrows. This is the promise that's made in the wisdom book. It's a consistent principle that we find. Back in Deuteronomy chapter 4 and verse 1. Again, now therefore hearken, O Israel, unto the statutes and unto the judgments which I teach you, for to do them, that ye may live and go in and possess the land which the Lord God of your fathers gives you. If you want to find peace, find wisdom. And don't just find it, but as Moses said, do it. So, wisdom is provided as the way to peace and happiness. And it deals with real life. As you keep reading in Proverbs, we certainly find that point made over and again. Let me look at a passage with you while we're here in Proverbs chapter 2. Let's begin again in verse 10. When wisdom enters your heart and knowledge is pleasant to your soul, discretion will preserve you and understanding will keep you. Going back to that idea, let me tell you, God's wisdom is a little bit like the safety harness on a roller coaster. Now, maybe that's not the best illustration, but it's one that comes to mind. I don't ride many roller coasters anymore, but I used to. But you know, I wouldn't be a bit interested in riding that roller coaster that slings you around if they didn't have some kind of safety harness thing. That just wouldn't be a good idea at all. The point is that when you go through the ups and downs in life, wisdom is what will keep you from getting hurt. It's what will keep you from doing hurt. And that point is made over and again in this great book. He gives two specific examples here that I think deal with real life. Verse 12, to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things. Perverse, this is the New King James. A modern translation may have something else to say, but the idea of perversity here is largely the idea of crookedness. It's the opposite of straight. You know, some people will tell you the straight, not just what's true, but what's right. But there are always people who have a shortcut, moral shortcut. And that guy is glad to abuse you and to trip you up. He speaks perverse things. Verse 13. From those who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, to rejoice in doing evil and delight in the perversity of the wicked, whose ways are crooked and who are devious in their paths. The evil man. Verse 16, to deliver you from the immoral woman, from the seductress who flatters with her words, who forsakes the companion of her youth and forgets the covenant of her God. For her house leads down to death, and her paths to the dead. None who go to her return, nor do they regain the paths of life. So you may walk in the way of goodness and keep the paths of righteousness. That's what he wants for us. But beware the evil woman. Beware the immoral man. I want to think with you about some other words from Proverbs that deal with these two very cases. And I think when we look at them, when we think about them, we can understand just how modern, how practical, how needed they are in every generation. Let's start out with that idea of this immoral man. Keep reading back in Proverbs 1 and in verse 11. And he deals with what sounds like a very modern situation. Suppose they say, this is again a modern paraphrase, suppose they say, come on, let us find someone to kill. Let us attack some innocent people for the fun of it. They'll be alive and well when we find them, but they'll be dead when we're through with them. We'll find all kinds of riches and fill our houses with loot. Come and join us, and we'll all share what we steal. My child, don't go with a people like that. Stay away from them. They can't wait to do something bad. They're always ready to kill. It does no good to spread a net with a bird you want to catch watching. But people like that are setting a trap for themselves, a trap in which they will die. Robbery always claims the life of the robber. This is what happens to anyone who lives by violence. You know, gang violence is not something new. I promise you right now, that happened last night in Birmingham. I don't know, I hadn't read the news today. It happens in every city of every size, just about every weekend. You're going to have this exact same scenario. And it certainly is tied with that love of money. Come with us, and we're going to go roll this old guy and beat him up. Who cares what happens to him? We'll take what he's got and spend it in some way that is also wicked. It's a mistake for us to think, well, that would never affect anybody we know. When the point of fact is, it has, over and again, even this extreme circumstance. I've shared this illustration with some of you before, I know, but it just, to me, is so fitting. I can hardly read this passage without thinking about it, without remembering it. This is a story from the Associated Press several years ago now about a man, an Alabama man, who was executed. A man convicted of killing a young girl during a robbery and kidnapping was executed in the state's electric chair Friday. David Ray Duran, 37, was the first inmate to be executed since the U.S. Supreme Court, so on and so forth. Duren was convicted of murder for the 1983 shooting death of Kathleen Bedsole, 16. He kidnapped the girl and her boyfriend, Chuck Leonard, from Leonard's car, put them in the trunk, drove them to a secluded area where they were shot. Leonard survived. It might surprise you if you don't already know this story. You know this fellow, David Duren, grew up going to a church in Birmingham? Our brethren. His grandparents were faithful members of a church, non-institutional church over on the east side of town. His parents weren't faithful. He went with his grandparents for a while. I think the parents split up. He wrote, now there's another side of this story that you may also want to know if you're not familiar with it. And that is that after this awful crime, after he was convicted, some folks who had known him in time past began to write him and visit him and do what they could. And it pricked David's heart. And David eventually was baptized in prison. And you say, well, that's that jailhouse religion. Well, the Lord be the judge of that. But I'll tell you one thing about this fella is that I think that he, in every way he knew how, showed a sincerity in trying to acknowledge his evil and to try to warn others. One of the things he did was, with the help of some brethren that you might know, I don't know who all, I know Joe Corley was involved in this. Some of you guys might know Brother Corley. Kyle Pope. Richard Copeland helped put this together. Some of us knew Brother Copeland. David Duren, in his repentance, and in his last few years, put together a booklet that began to be published and disseminated called An Attitude Adjustment, Learning to Live Inside. And I won't read the entirety of the pamphlet, though it's worth reading. But I'll read just a line or two, if you'll bear with me, with our text in mind. My name is David. I'm 36 years old. I'm writing to you from death row, where I'm awaiting execution for the 1983 murder of Nancy Kathleen Bedsole and the attempted murder of Charles Leonard, Jr. This is a shameful thing to admit, as will be many of the things that I will share with you about my life. But it's my hope that through sharing these things with you, that I may help you or those you know from making the same poor choices I made. I spent the last 16 years waiting for this sentence to be carried out. As you can imagine, I've had a lot of time to look back on my life and see where I went wrong. I can honestly say that it all began at the age of 13 when I stopped attending church. I know that's probably what you would expect me to say, except it's absolutely true. And he goes on to say, it was about that time that I started smoking. This marked a change in my life, not so much the cigarettes themselves, but the attitude which led me to make the decision to smoke, knowing that it was wrong. Knowing it was wrong to smoke, I decided to do it anyway, because it was what I wanted to do. It was this attitude which would cause me and those around me to suffer so many problems for the next 8 years to come, the consequences of my actions for the rest of my life. Isn't that something? He said, yeah, that's where I got off the track. Just pure willfulness and something that many people would see to be innocent. You wouldn't see it that way. But it's so easy once you get off the road to get lost and to hardly find your way back. He talks about his story. He was short and very small for his age, and he got picked on. And then he said, I was looking for something. He had trouble at home, and he was looking for some family, quote unquote. You know, he said, for some reason, I picked the very people that treated me so badly to try to fit in and please them. And so he did. And so he talks about this journey and how that affected his life. He talks about learning. First of all, his family sent him to the military to try to straighten him out. Didn't work. He came back with a dishonorable discharge. Then one after another, his father and others would try to get him a job, and he'd mess that up, embarrass them. All the time spiraling. And then with this group that he was with, learning how to use various drugs and to have to find a way to pay for them. He got into stealing and then into robbery and threatening people with a knife over here in East Lake Park and other places, to get drug money. And then, again, without going into a lot of the detail, in a short span of time, he was one of 3 fellows who went to rob a young couple in which the young woman was killed, and the young man, they thought they had killed him, but he survived, went to authorities. They rounded him up quickly and identified him. And and I think I understand this correctly, in legal circumstances, if you've got 2 or 3 fellows there robbing, it doesn't matter if everybody's got a gun or not, or who pulled the trigger. Everybody's guilty of murder if there's a murder that takes place. They're all charged. And so David was charged. He talks about the humiliation of the trial, having to face people that he had done this to, how he wished he didn't exist. And then being convicted by the jury, found guilty, sentenced and taken to death row, he says, on September 15th. And there in my 8-foot-long, 5-foot-wide cell, I finally came to the attitude adjustment I so desperately needed. Seeing the complete disaster I'd made of my life, I focused my mind on eternity. I thought to myself how utterly foolish it would be to accept an eternity in hell that would be infinitely more miserable than what I had created in my life and the lives of others on earth. It's shameful to say that I did not change my attitude before destroying so many lives. And he continues his thoughts. He wrote several papers. One of them that I have here is a letter from death row, not long at all before his sentence was passed out and executed upon him. And he writes here in conclusion in this, listen to me. He said, I'm not writing this just to have something to do. I could be doing something more pleasant. Do you think it's fun for me to sit here and tell you that I murdered a 16-year-old girl because I was so strung out on drugs and booze I didn't know how to act like a responsible citizen? Do you think it's fun for me? It's humiliating, embarrassing, generally downright painful to have to relate that. Learn from my mistake, he says. Maybe you realize, he goes on, the perils of peer pressure and are not into the drug scene. Good. You're on the right track. Maybe you know someone you care about who is now walking that dead-end street. If so, share this letter with them. Maybe you're hanging out with the wrong crowd that's influencing you to go places and do things that you ought not to do. I have cost an innocent girl her life, and I have ruined, I'm sorry to say, countless other lives by doing so. Learn from my mistake. Doesn't that sound like Proverbs 1? Doesn't that sound like the warning of Proverbs 1? But my point is simply that the Proverbs are not just sort of old peculiar sayings. They talk about real life. And after all the centuries and all the changes, the fact is that temptation and trial look very similar. So as young people learning the danger of peer pressure, whatever age we are, learning the danger of intoxicants, learning the danger of covetousness. People who think that as long as material gain comes at the end of a decision, then the decision is right. I don't know where I found this, but I thought this was really a good illustration. Somebody here on the left, I guess as you're looking at it, said no plus money equals yes. That's true in a lot of places. I will never do that. How much you say? Well, might rethink that a minute. Changing our behavior and our morals based upon how much money is involved. Years ago, a brother made this point. He said, it's funny how people will talk, I'm talking about legitimate jobs, not criminal activity, about taking a better job. I've taken a better job. Better job. What's better about it? The fact that you're not able to attend services, you're not able to see your family, that you're working so long and so hard you can do nothing else? Better job. Define better. The compromises, that are always there just just biting at us. I think about that passage in Proverbs 13 and verse 7. The old translation reads this way: there is that maketh himself rich, yet hath nothing. And there is that maketh himself poor, yet hath great riches. Some of the modern translations, maybe the wording might suggest a different meaning, but I'm sort of wedded to the old translation, and I don't see any particular reason to think this is not a correct. I'm not some sort of a textual critic. But as you read the old translation, the point seems to be there's some people who think they're rich and they're really poor. And there's some people you might think are poor that are really rich. I know that's a Bible concept because in 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and in verse 10, Paul is talking about his lot. The choice he made to preach the gospel closed a lot of doors, but it opened a lot of others. It took away some potential advantages materially, but he gained so many more. And so he writes that his circumstance was such that he is unknown yet well known. Verse 9, dying and yet we live, chastened but not killed, sorrowful yet always rejoicing. Notice, poor yet making many rich. Exactly. I wish every person, every young person here, what are you going to do with your life? How about choosing the path of wisdom and finding something? You've got to make a living, but finding something that allows you to always put God first. And don't ever compromise your principle because, you can get with a company that's paying you so much money they expect you to do whatever they tell you to do. Even if you know it's wrong. Even if it comes, you got to lie for them. You got to steal for them. And once they get you in that big house and that big car and all those big bills, then they got that hook in your mouth. And it's hard to break that. So, Lord, help us to see this 2,000-year-old, 3,000-year-old warning. Beware of covetousness. Luke has so many great lessons there, and our time is drawing to a close. But in Luke chapter 12, when the Lord told that story about the fellow who thought his biggest problem in the world was that he just had such a successful business, he just didn't know what he was going to do with all the profits. That's my biggest problem. I don't know what to do with all this yield. I'm just going to have to tear down my barns and build greater. And then I can really start enjoying life. What his real problem was, as the Lord went on to explain, is this is your last day on earth. You're going to meet God. And here's the worst thing, you're not ready. Because everything that you take as an advantage, you're going to leave behind. We leave everything behind, don't we? We carry nothing with us except our naked soul that stands before God and will be judged. So it was the Lord who said in the same context, He said, lay up treasure in heaven where moth and rust do not corrupt and where thieves don't break through and steal. Where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. We were talking about that earlier today. And that's right. Luke chapter 16, just flip over a page or two, and provides an unforgettable example of a man who died rich but found out he was actually poor, lifting up his eyes, being in torments, desiring a drop of water that he might cool his tongue. We cannot miss the point, but I can decide not to think about that or think that applies to everybody else and not me. God help me to see that the path of wisdom leads to peace now and peace later. I think about Proverbs 28. This lesson taught in other words in the Proverbs. A poor person who walks in his integrity is better than one who is perverse in his ways, even though he's rich. Better to be poor. If it involves the sacrifice of integrity, far better to hold integrity and give up anything else. 22 and verse 1 is unforgettable. A good name is rather to be chosen than great riches, and loving favor is better than silver and gold. And don't forget this, by the way, that poor and rich in material terms, the Lord's the maker of them all, and that's the real important point. In Proverbs 15 and verse 16, better to have a little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and turmoil. Exactly. So, here's the point. It doesn't matter what age you are. There'll always be a crowd there looking to pull you over to their side, to take their values, to compromise your principles for gain of some type, material gain. But what do you lose in order to gain this? The wise wisdom personified would say, never forget and don't ever pay the price they're asking you to pay. I think about Proverbs 1 and verse 32. The turning away of the simple shall slay them, and the prosperity of fools shall destroy them. But whoso hearkeneth unto me shall dwell safely, and shall be quiet from the fear of evil. That's right. Where are you headed today? Where are you headed today? My hope, my prayer would be that all of us might remember to put first things first, that all of us might have the dedication, the wisdom to remember that God's way is always the best way. It'll shape your life. The earlier you can learn that, the better. The less compromises you make, the less pain you'll have. I hope in the next lesson to talk about the other part of that example that we read there from chapter 2. That the lure of evil and moral shortcuts, materialism, that's always there. So also is the lure of sexual sin and immorality for young and old. And let's talk about that because there's some very plain spoken language in the Proverbs. Let's talk about that in a lesson. Remember these great old lessons. In order to bolster our faith and to prepare ourselves and to guard our hearts against the same old lies, the same old temptations the devil's been pulling on human beings since the beginning. I appreciate your kind attention. The song that's been selected by Gable is Take My Life and Let It Be. If that's your desire tonight to be baptized into Christ, it'd be a great time to do that. Come with your whole heart. Come with the kind of dedication this song demands. But let it be so. Maybe we've made those promises, but we have not kept them. If there's something that we'd like to make right with God, right with the brethren, tonight would be a great time to do that. And if we can help you, let us know how even right now. While we stand and sing, will you please come?